friends. This is Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the conversation series where I get to sit down and chat with other writers, and it's always a good time. It's always entertaining, and I feel like I always learn something. I love when, they just dole out pearls of wisdom, and that I get energized by that. So, and today was no exception. I'll talk about my guest today in just a second. Just a reminder that my Unbound Writer company is now open and operational, and we are taking reservations for my October writing retreat in Boulder, Colorado. I am also offering one-on-one coaching for all of your writing coaching needs. And soon we're going to be launching our online classes, and you can read more about our offerings all online at unboundwriter.com. So today on the show, I had Louise Doughty, and God damn it, I hope I'm saying that right. Doughty. Doughty. Louise, I'm really sorry if I'm if I'm butchering your name, because Louise is a big deal, and she would be the first person to tell you she's not a big deal, but she's a big goddamn deal. She is the author of 10 novels, one work of nonfiction, 5 plays for radio, and a TV miniseries. She was her book Blackwater was nominated as one of the New York Times notable books of the year, and the one preceding that was the bestseller Apple Tree Yard, which has been published or is being translated into 30 languages and adapted into a highly successful BBC One television series starring Emily Watson. So I met Louise in Iceland. We were on a panel together at Iceland Noir, and I think the panel was about family secrets, which we talked about a little bit in the podcast. And I remember we wrapped up the panel. She was so honest and funny and just fresh in her comments that I kind of thought I want to talk to her more. So I invited her to be on the podcast. And several months later, we were able to make it happen. But her perspective was fantastic. I mean, this is somebody who, from a very young age, she wrote her first novel, quote unquote, at the age of 11. You'll hear more about that. But she got her MA in creative writing, in her early 20s. And so she was very committed to this. Is, I think, how she said it. She had this kind of revelation of this. How do you want to spend your days? And she realized, I want to spend my days writing. And even though she wasn't published for a decade after making that decision, she had very little financial commitments, and she could, more or less afford to spend a decade in her 20s in not the greatest living conditions in order to spend her filling her days doing the things that she wanted to do, namely writing, which I loved hearing that story, because how often do we have that kind of spontaneous wisdom at that young age to make a decision of, I don't know what this is going to look like, but this is what I want to do with my life. Usually we commit to something that at least feels more responsible, but is usually not nearly as satisfying as that one thing that we really want to do. And here's a person who just said, I just want to do this. And, obviously she's changed a lot over time, and her writing has changed. She's written several different types of books, and she's been in the psychological thriller genre for quite a few books now. But like everything else, we evolve, and but she's remained true to herself, I think, is the main thing. And we wrapped up the conversation just talking about, if you look at what she's written over time, she says, it looks like I had a plan to pivot from this to this, and then to pivot again to a different type of book. She's like, no, I was just telling the story that I wanted to tell, and just hoping against hope that somebody would want to buy it. And I really think that's the way to write. That's how I coach my clients as well. It's like, be true to yourself, because if you're trying to chase the market, or if you're trying to do something that doesn't feel natural to your way of writing, it's going to show. And I think your best success comes from writing the story that you want to write, not necessarily writing the stories you think others just want to read. So anyway, we had a fantastic conversation. Our story at the end flowed very nicely, and as always, got dark. So I was happy with that. And yeah, it was a good time. Folks, you're going to like this one. This is my conversation with Louise, I'm going to say, Doughty. Where in England are
I
you?
am in London in my house. It's 7:30 in the evening, and I'm in the room I laughingly refer to as my study. But
Mm.
actually, the computer's angled towards the bookshelves because over that side of the room, there's the guest bed,
It's just chaos.
there's junk, there's boxes, there's heaps of coats that I hardly ever use. It's a big room, and it's the room in the house that nobody sleeps in. So it's like the everything room, and
But
it's
at
also
least you're
where I
not
write novels. But a
blurring
lot
at
of other
all.
things happen in this room.
But at least you're not blurring the background. That always drives me nuts when people blur their backgrounds because it makes me really want to know what they're trying to hide.
I know, and it's the best thing about Zoom. In fact, I think it's probably the only good thing about Zoom is we get to kind of nose around each other's houses. So yeah,
That's
I'm with
right.
you there.
So we
And can you
met.
hear me all right?
I
Is all the tech okay?
The tech is perfect. I can hear you great. Thank you. Um,
Great, great, good.
so I had the pleasure of sitting next to you on a panel at Iceland Noir, which was my first time at Iceland Noir,
Yeah.
which was great. But it always cracks me up the idea of these panels because you just get assigned to these panels, and you don't know who's doing the vetting. And I think our panel was like uh, family secrets. And
Yes.
I wasn't quite sure where it was going to go because I don't know if this happens to you, but if you tend to write kind of dark, mysterious things, people always want to know what happened to you as a kid. And when it comes to family secrets, they think that you had this terrible childhood and you can't wait to tell the world about it through your characters. And for me, nothing could be further from the truth. I don't know if you get that question a lot.
Absolutely. And I get it particularly when it comes to sex and relationships. I don't know whether it's the same for guys or not, but certainly as a woman writer, the minute you write about sex or a relationship, everybody assumes it's autobiographical. And in the case
Hmm.
of Apple Tree Yard, my most well-known book, this was rather embarrassing because it's about a woman who jeopardizes her marriage by having sex with a stranger in a public place that she's only just met. And when I was doing publicity tour for it, there was always an awkward moment at an event when somebody would raise their hand and say, "Oh, Louise, yeah, I'm just wondering, how much of what is in the book is autobiographical?" And my stock answer for this was because my main character is a top scientist. I'd always say, "You want to know if I have ever really been one of the nation's top geneticists?" And of
Exactly.
course,
Exactly. If
that's
there
not
were
what they were angling for.
but that drives me nuts because if there wasn't that scene in the book, you wouldn't have probably had any questions about how much of the book was autobiographical. But because
No,
of that
no.
scene, yeah, that's and that's not even such a bizarre, strange scene. It's a critical scene that explains that's necessary for the book. So yeah, I
Yes, I
try.
did have also some interesting publicity requests.
Yeah, yeah, I can
Sorry, we
imagine.
spoke over each other for a bit. I think it's a bit of a delay. No, no, I was just remembering the time that Time Out, which is a big London listings magazine, rang me up and they said we do a 10 best features, 10 best Thai restaurants or 10 best river walks. And we wondered if you'd like to do one on 10 best places to have sex in public in London. And I had to go, guys, A, I made it up. And B, if I wasn't, am I really going to write that piece? I don't think
Right,
so.
right. It almost sounds like you wrote this book in the 1950s where it was like
Yeah,
shocking or
yeah.
that's but it's I mean sex is a difficult thing to write about, I think. And because I think from my experience doing a lot of reading, it's not typically done well.
Mm,
So if I ever have a sex scene, which is very rare, it's got to be very it's got to really advance the story. It has to be really meaningful to the story. And there's nothing that drives me more nuts when it's just like it's same thing, and the exact same thing with violence, right? Like what's the point of
absolutely.
somebody getting shot here and then they just get up and run away and next scene we don't even
Yeah.
acknowledge that. Do you when you go through when you go through the editing process, do you take a different look at the scenes that you've written and say like, okay, this is maybe too much or not necessary regarding sex or violence, or like, I think it should be longer.
Yeah. No, I think you hit the nail on the head there when you say the problem with those scenes is that in the next scene, it's like nothing's happened. So I think to me, the key to writing sex or violence or any other kind of large physical thing is something called consequences. You know, what are
Mhm.
the consequences of this act? How does a character feel in the next scene? And, you know, television and film have a lot to answer for. And, you know, think of the number of scenes we've seen where cars roll over and over and the characters just crawl out of them unscathed. In the next minute,
Right.
they're running down the road as opposed to spending 6 weeks in hospital. And when you write a novel, that's the difference between writing a novel or an action movie. It's about consequences. It's about following through. What happens next?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really well said. And it's about kind of readers and audiences' expectations. Because I remember thinking, like, even watching James Bond films, at a certain point, you stop caring about James Bond because nothing ever happened to him. He was
Yeah,
unscathed
yeah.
all the time. And so it gets boring after a while. But on the other hand, like, if you think about a single punch to the face, that would knock me out for days. Like, I would be done with one. So,
Mm.
but you can't really
Mhm.
have that either. There's got to be some kind of middle ground. And sometimes I read a great book
Yeah.
once about writing violence. Like, this is actually what happens to the human
Ah.
body when all these different things happen. And it changed
Mm.
the way I approach those scenes because it makes it so much more meaningful. And you use the word feeling, like, how are they? And I think that has to always bubble to the surface of every novel. Like, what are the emotional stakes and consequences here? Because otherwise it's boring, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, it's all about your reader's investment in the character. And when I used to teach creative writing many years ago, I haven't done it for a while, but I always used to say to students, if it's not about the magnitude of the event, if your reader doesn't care about the character, then you can have them fall down 100-foot well. And like you say, the reader will be bored because they don't believe in the character, they're not invested. But if the characters is really, really compulsive on an emotional level, then the reader gets upset if they stub their toe. You know, it's
Right.
always about is your reader engaged in the character?
Right. And that's about creating empathy, right? And I think yeah, and I think it's very difficult to do that unless you yourself, as the author, are kind of a naturally empathetic person, especially depending on what voice. If you're writing first person present tense, I think you really have to have a lot of your own empathy. But how did you learn that? Like, I know, you have 10 books out now, I believe. And how did you
It
learn?
is, yeah, I published my 10th last year.
That's amazing. That's amazing. My 10th will be next January, so I'm almost there. I don't
Oh,
I don't have
congratulations.
I don't have the TV shows or the miniseries yet, but I'm working on it. Um, but it's hard to have that perspective, especially when you're starting out, to know if you've written a character that people are going to care about. So, how did you approach that when you really first started novel writing? Did you look to alpha and beta readers, critique groups, agents, editors to tell you it's working or it's not working?
I did to a certain extent. I did an MA in creative writing at the University of East Anglia, which is sort of it's our kind of Iowa workshop. You know, it's
Okay.
the kind of
Mhm.
most prestigious creative writing course. But in retrospect, I was probably too young when I did it. I think I was 22 and I was very emotionally immature and immature in terms of my prose style as well.
Mhm.
And so most of the feedback I got quite regularly, quite justifiably and regularly was pretty negative. And there was quite a lot of sobbing in the ladies' lavatory before or after, and sometimes
Uh-huh.
during seminars. But it was no more than I deserved. I probably should have done it later when I would have got more out of it. But I've always given my work to friends, and I have my own sort of focus group, if you like. I have 3 or 4 friends who I really trust. A couple of them are not writers themselves, and we swap work. You know, if I read my friend's novel, I'll take them out to dinner, and if they read mine, it's the other way round. Um, and then I've got a couple of friends I've got one who's a retired police officer who reads all my stuff. I've got another friend who's an Anglican vicar who I've known since
Mm.
university. She reads it. I've got another friend who's a GP. And what's interesting is they're not connected with each other. So
Hmm.
if they all make the same point, I know I have to listen.
Yeah.
And quite often they do all make the same point. They will all say the opening's too slow, or the ending wraps up too quickly, or I didn't believe this character. And if half a dozen disparate people are telling you the same thing, and I always give it to my that group of friends before it goes anywhere near my publisher. I don't let
Hmm.
anything go to my publisher until it's been read by them.
That's great. And that's a difficult thing to do, is to cultivate that group of people. And that maybe is just one person. But when you start out and you join critique groups and you have online clubs, and there's so many voices giving you totally different advice, and to figure out who's right, who's wrong, if any of them are, that's a skill in and of itself. That takes years, doesn't it?
It does. And in fact, one of the best pieces of advice I was given in the MA class was from Malcolm Bradbury, late great Malcolm Bradbury, wonderful writer. And he said to us all very sternly at the beginning of the year, 90% of what you hear in this workshop is going to be useless, but 10% is going to be completely invaluable. And he
Wow.
said, your job is to work out what that 10% is.
Oh, wow.
And I found that such a helpful thing because, as you say, if you're in an online group and people's different opinions are coming, quite often it's about people's personality type. The most
Mhm.
vociferous person in the room might sway the opinion of a group. That doesn't mean they're necessarily right. And sifting the wheat from the chaff is your job as a writer. And
Right.
also, I would say, making sure that you are listening with your intellect rather than your ego, because we all have a gut feeling when we're criticized. It's like, whoa, hold on, no, defense, attack, I didn't like your stuff either, kind of thing. And actually detaching your ego, not responding, not saying anything, keeping your ears open and your mouth shut, and then taking the advice and going away with it. And then maybe in 24 hours, you think, you know what, I reacted really badly to that comment. But the reason I reacted really badly is because in my heart of hearts, I know they had a point.
Right. Right.
So developing that skill, growing the hide of a rhinoceros in the face of criticism, I think is absolutely crucial if you're going to engage in those groups.
Right. I mean, that's one of my, when I do coaching, one of my tenets is you learn to not only accept criticism, but to embrace it, because
Mm.
there's gold in that criticism and
Yeah.
in that rejection. I mean, most of the criticism a lot of times comes in the form of outright rejection of what you're trying to do. And
Yeah.
people, writers, I mean, I get it, because as a writer, you invest so much time, even with your 10th, 11th book, it still takes a lot of time. It's still a lot of work. There's still tears involved. And when somebody just dismisses it, it's very painful, but you do get better at a time, and learning how to be objective, like you said, is absolutely necessary. Because how do you advance? How many times does rejection stop writers from actually even continuing their journey? I mean, I know writers who have just
Yeah.
quit because they can't handle just even sharing their work, much less getting it rejected.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the act of exposure is very painful, and it is a hard thing to learn. It does get less painful, I think. I saw Hanif Qureshi give a talk once, and he said, the minute I hit send on the email sending my new novel to my agent, I suddenly realize every single thing that is wrong with it. Because the minute you anticipate somebody else reading it, you go, yeah, that thing, I've just been hoping against hope I'd get away with it, but no, I really won't.
Yeah.
But like you say, I mean, we write to be read. We write to communicate. We want, if you eventually want your book to go out there to a reading public, then you have to start somewhere with that kind of exposure. And I am a huge fan of creative writing courses, mentoring schemes, of showing your work to other people, because really, how else do you toughen your hide before you go near the industry?
Right. And that doesn't mean that the critics are right, but it means that you're
No,
learning, and it's an invaluable life skill, not just for for writing,
it
to
is.
be able to what I mean, I'm kind of a little bit different. When I hit send, to me, it's I'm done, or at least for the moment. I don't worry about it, because I'm like, I've done the best that I can. I know it's not perfect. It's nowhere close to
Mm,
perfect, and they are going to help me make it better. But in the meantime, I'm on to the next thing, because how many people do you know who like are
mm,
trying, like even with the galleys, like trying to make substantial changes because they're just not
yeah.
satisfied. And you got to just let it go, I think.
You have got to let it go. And I think it's the same with the publication process. I know authors who are agonizing over the fate of their novel 3, 6 months, a year after it was published. But if you stay too emotionally invested, then, like you say, you're never going to get on with the next thing. And I give a novel 6 weeks after publication. Up until that point, I will, I'll tweet, I'll do whatever is required of me, and I'll still do events after those 6 weeks, or things like Ice and Noir, but I won't really care about them. I
Right.
have a period. It begins about 3 months before publication, and then I have a cutoff point. 6 weeks after publication, I look at the book and I say, "You're on your own, baby. I will go out there and I'll do the festivals and the events, but I've divested myself from you, my ego investment. I'm on to the next thing." And I think you have to do that. Otherwise,
Yeah.
you'll never write the next book.
Yeah, you're 100% right. My latest book came out almost 2 weeks ago, and I've already kind of not forgotten about it, but I'm not really
That's
promoting
good.
it as
two
much
weeks
because
is
I feel
quick.
like
Yeah.
I've done the most of it, but I did a lot, and the PR team did a lot, and
Mm.
then you just kind of like you've raised this kid, and you just hope that they don't like overdose in college or whatever.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. That's
You're
a
like,
pretty
I've done.
brutal way of putting it, but yes, it's true. Yeah.
I've done the best I can. You're out in the world, and God bless. But so you got your MA, as you said, at a pretty early age, at a pretty young age. So you must have known this is what I want to do.
Yes, I've always written stories as a child, and I wrote a first novel when I was 11.
Oh, wow.
And it's a bit sad. I filled an exercise book, and I decided I wanted it to be a hardback, so I cut out the cardboard bit of a cereal packet and sellotaped it to my exercise book to make it into a hardback. I know I took myself very seriously at that age.
Everybody wants to
And
be in hardcover.
it it was yeah, it was very strange. I was an odd child, obviously. I mean, I grew up in a small town in the East Midlands. Trust me, there wasn't a lot deal else to do. It was either that or teach myself to smoke in a local bus shelter. So
Mhm.
instead, I wrote the novel. And then during my adolescence, for a while, I wanted to be a great actress. I wanted to
Mm.
be, Glenda Jackson, a classical stage actress. And then I went off to university. I did a degree in English literature. And it was towards the end of that I thought, which I think is the crucial question for anybody, particularly when you're young, is forget career paths, money, all the rest of it. When I wake up in the morning, how do I want to spend my time? And the minute I asked
Mm.
myself that question, the answer was writing. I mean, that's what I want to do each day. I want to get up and I want to go to my desk and I want to be a writer. And I think once I'd decided that, it was sort of a bit like a religious conversion, really. I mean, that was it. That was all I was going to do for the rest of my life. It took me another 10 years to get published from that point, by the way.
Well, of
But
course. Yeah.
I was a writer from that point, although I was not a published writer, a professional writer for another
Right.
decade, but I
Right.
was a
Right.
writer from that point.
But that's a pretty mature and profound question to ask of oneself at that age. That's a question a 50-year-old is usually
Mm,
asking themselves, right? Because you have this idea that you have to earn, you have to help support, whatever family you're a part of or microcosm, and you always put what you want, I think, secondary. That's a very common thing to do. And to say, I want
mm,
to do this thing that through your experience is going to not pay me at all for at least 10 years. And that's a
mm,
very common thing is very bold. I mean, that's almost like you said, like a religious awakening to have that I mean, that's kind of what happened to me too. So I'm always amazed when people have a sudden clarity that comes out of nowhere, and that it takes
yeah.
you being curious about that, right? To really listen to what that is, and to be true to it rather than to dismiss it. So that's a very courageous thing to have done for you, I think.
Yes, and I mean, looking back on it, a lot of it was the naivety of youth.
Right. That's
I
important though.
obviously, well, it's important. And at that stage, at 21, I had no responsibilities. I moved to London after I did the MA. I was living in a squat in Southeast London. I was,
Mhm.
living off baked potatoes. I got a part-time job a couple of days a week as a secretary. And someone in the office said, "Why do you only work 2 days a week?" And I said, "Well, because I can't live on one day's wages." But, all I needed was basic food money while I wrote my novel the rest of the time. And obviously, if you make that decision when you're 40 and you've got a massive mortgage and 3 kids to support, it's a lot harder because those economic realities kick in. But I think it was one of my great pieces of good luck as a writer, was to realize how badly I wanted it at a time when I had no other responsibilities. My only responsibilities were to myself,
Yeah.
and to keep myself alive, which, seeing as I was living very cheaply, I could do. And that was a great, it took me 10 years, but at that stage of my life, I did have those 10 years. I spent the whole of my 20s living in horrible places, really, and being ill quite a lot of the time because there was
Oh.
black mold. Um,
Oh,
but
Jesus.
I didn't have children until my 30s, by which
Yeah.
time I'd already published a couple of books and I was more established. So
Yeah. And you probably needed those 10 years, right? To
absolutely.
develop yourself. I mean, do you ever look back and think about, had you, if self-publishing were a bigger thing back then, had you just, okay, I'm going to self-publish my first book and it's probably not ready. I wonder what would have happened to your career.
You know that painting, The Scream, don't you? The Munch. The thought, if my first book, I wrote 2 complete novels before the one that was published, if either of those books were available in print, online, out there in any form whatsoever, I would die of embarrassment. I could be
Right.
blackmailed with those manuscripts. I was, like I say, I was very immature. I wrote great rambling. I think I thought writers got paid by the metaphor,
Right.
and wrote this kind of lush prose, dripping with adjectives and adverbs, I thought, Beckett, Pinter, Kafka, I'm going
Right.
to show them how it's done, really,
Right.
guys. Stand up, guys. I'm going to show them how it's done. I mean, they were terrible, both of those first books. And thank God that option wasn't available to me. And obviously, the rejection was hard. They were both turned down by everybody, but they deserved to be.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I learned. And I didn't really start writing halfway decent prose until my late 20s.
Yeah.
And I needed that time.
Yeah, totally. And that's nothing against self-publishing, but I think if you are making the decision as a first-time author to self-publish and you've tried to sell it and it keeps getting rejected, make sure you're really understanding why it's
Yeah.
being, and sometimes you get rejected because it's just not right for them at the right time and your writing's great. That's one totally different thing. But it's a living, breathing forever thing once it's out there. Anyone can go
Mm.
back and look at that, and it can be, it can be devastating if you're not careful about it. But I'm like you. I got an agent with my first book, but my first 3 books didn't sell.
Yeah.
So I just like, and I had no ego because I didn't know what I was doing. So I'm like, oh, of course they didn't sell. They're terrible. I don't know what I'm doing. Um,
Yes.
but so for me, it was about 10 years, 9 years until my first book was published by a very, very small publishing house. But I needed that time. I needed
Yeah,
to teach
absolutely.
myself how to write because I didn't know.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine if I had just self-published. And from book 1 to book 10 of published books, my writing has totally changed.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've kind of, have you seen that? Do you go back and look at that first published book and think like, not that it's good or bad, but that it's so different than what you're writing, how you write now?
My first novel is the only thing of mine I really can't bear to go back to. I just like, every now and then a
Mhm.
phrase from it pops into my head and I just cringe. And in fact, to be honest, I don't know about you, but I feel my first 3 books were fall into the category of what I would rather dismissively call early work.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
feel that there was a big leap forward with novel number 4, where I changed tack and I wrote a big historical book. And then I wrote 2 historical novels. And then I really only hit my stride in what we might call the psychological thriller category with novel number 6.
Mhm.
I didn't want to make the mistake of saying on Twitter that I was a bit embarrassed by my first 3 novels, forgetting that I was followed by the editor who had bought them, who sort of went, excuse me. um, but no, you change as a person. I mean, you
Yeah.
wouldn't, if you look back on relationships you had 20, 30 years ago, you feel slightly embarrassed, and because you were a different person then. And it's exactly the same with novels. I don't know, which of your novels did you stop being embarrassed? I think they
Yeah,
were okay.
probably my well, it's funny because I think when you start writing novels, I think you come from the mindset of like, well, how is it done? Let me look at other samples and I'll do it how it's supposed to be done. And then you eventually get to the place of, oh, this is how I do it. And
Yeah.
I think that took me 4 or 5 novels, and it took me from switching from third person past tense point of view to first
Mm.
person present. Actually, the first book that I wrote from a female point of view, first person present, was the first time I felt like, oh, this is my voice. This is now I can feel like this is
Yeah.
my voice. And that was my 5th published book. And
Yeah.
it's funny because I almost always write first person present tense. And then the book that just came out, I had originally written it third person past because I was scared. I doubted myself because it was the point of view of a 21-year-old female savant. And I'm like, I just don't know if I can be close enough to this person and it
Mm.
didn't work. So I had to rewrite the
Yeah.
entire thing. But there was a valuable lesson to be true to your voice, as challenging as it could be. But I think every book that you write, it's a timestamp in your own history. And you can look back
Yes.
and like, oh, I remember what I was thinking then. My kids were this age then. That's why
Mm.
these parts are so emotional. And I like that because it's just who you are, whether it's a good book or a bad book. It's just where it's like watching TV shows. The TV shows you liked as a kid are so much more memorable to me than the ones I like now because that's just
Yes.
the space I was in as a kid.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, that is the great joy of being a writer, and also the terrifying thing about being a writer, because you are revealing yourself on the page. You are living a life on your page, however highly disguised it is. Um, and I think in some sense, it's wonderful because you feel that, you're leaving this record behind. But which of us is not embarrassed by the person we were when we were 23 or
Right.
24,
Right.
so in a way, if it takes you a long time to be published, be grateful. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I've never once wished that I had had huge overnight success with an early novel that I'd written in my youth. Never once. I can genuinely say, I feel no envy of young people who publish an acclaimed debut at the age of 22. Good luck to them. I never wished it had happened to me.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to a lot of writers, and I've definitely talked to writers who had instant success with their debut, regardless of their age, and
Mm.
almost to a person, it's never followed up.
Yeah.
Your second isn't bigger, and sometimes it takes books and books and books to get back to that place, if you ever get back to that place. And that's one thing I've learned for sure is like there is no linear path to a writer's career. Be grateful if you're published
Yeah.
at all. Even if there's no advance, at the fact that somebody's taking a chance on you, that's really hard to get to that space, and then
Yeah.
to actually build on that and make it into an actual feasible career is nearly impossible for most people. So if you have some kind of income from it, you should just it's hard not to you know
Absolutely.
be cynical, but it's such a tough industry.
It really is. And I never lose sight of the fact of what an immense privilege it is to be a published writer. I mean, I'm sure you do too. You meet,
Mhm.
hundreds of people who want that, who really need the validation, who work hard for it, who are often talented. And as you say, There are many, many reasons why talented writers don't break through and don't get published. And, you know, I just think I've had this enormous, I mean, yes, I've worked hard and I hope I'm talented, but there is a huge amount of luck involved. And, you know, I've been lucky, and there isn't a single day where I don't think I feel really, really lucky to be a professional writer. It's all I really wanted. Phew, I've got away with it so far. But maybe they're
I,
going to
and,
work
and
it
I
out.
always try to dissect what you just described. Like, okay, what is that magic thing that separates the published from the unpublished? And there is no obviously magic bullet that
Mm,
answers that question. But from talking to hundreds of writers, I realized one thing is tenacity, and and you also
absolutely.
referenced that hard work. Nothing happens unless you're sitting down every day and writing. Like, it just does, like anything else, it doesn't happen if you're
Yeah.
waiting for the muse. And nothing happens if you just sit there and let the abuse and the rejection, drown you. And some people just, and so a lot of what stops most people are themselves, I think.
Yeah.
And or they could say, I've written 5 books and none of them have sold, but are they willing to learn from the rejections? Are they willing to change maybe
Mm,
what they're doing, or really be objective about it? So, but yes, luck, absolutely. How many times have you heard it just has to land with the right person at the right time?
yeah.
And you can't control that, but learning to understand what you can't control, I think it's also an important skill set to have as an author, because you can release all that negative energy spent worrying about it.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I think one of the wisest things that I've heard is that writers are not people who want to write so much as people who can't not write.
Right.
You
Right.
know, if you go into it because you want the acclaim or the money or whatever, that's not a good enough reason. The
No,
only
it's
real
a
reason
terrible
to do it is
reason.
because you just can't make sense of your life unless you do it. You
Yeah.
can't not do it. And I definitely fall into that category, and I'm guessing you do too.
It is. It's really funny you bring that up, because when I'm coaching and we're working with the client, we always start out at the base level of like, I always ask them, why are you writing? And don't just give me an answer. Take a day, think about it, write it down on a piece, really think about why you're writing. And for me, that why was exactly that, because my why that I learned over time was, I can't picture myself not doing this. And I
Yeah.
don't have any better answer than that. But if your why is for the money, then you should just quit, because that's that's the
Yeah,
worst possible.
definitely.
I mean, there's really no wrong answer except for that answer. But I
Yeah.
think, people need to explore why they're doing it, because it controls a lot of the future, depending on how you answer that question. If you just like the
Yeah.
idea of being a writer, that's going to be a tough road.
Yes,
So
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And you
And I think also,
go ahead.
yeah, no, carry on, go on.
I was
No,
just
I
going
was
to
saying, I
say,
think all right, okay. I was going to say my next pearl of wisdom was going to be I think there's a really healthy thing you can do as a writer, whether you're published or not, is to try and think of it as almost as if you've got two jobs. You've got writing, and then you've got being a writer. And being a writer is
mm,
all the other stuff. And success as well as failure is in that bracket. You know,
mhm,
success can stop writers in their tracks as much as failure can.
mhm.
So if you think, I've got my first and primary task is to actually sit at the desk and do the writing, but I do have this other job of being a writer, which is, you know, going to festivals, giving interviews, emailing your agent, calling up somebody about the German tax form that you have to fill
Social
in,
media.
doing social media, all those things. Just put that all in a different bracket and say to yourself, okay, I have two jobs, but I'm going to keep them separate. And certainly I find that really helps me, saying I'm a morning writer, and mornings are for actual writing. Any being a writer type jobs, they have to go in the afternoon.
Mm,
And it's just a very simple rule
yeah,
uh,
I love
that
that.
means I keep those two separate and they don't interfere with each other.
Yep. I love that. I think that, I mean, because I'm the same. I only write an hour a day. That's all I do, but I do it
Mm.
7 days a week. And that's my dedicated,
Yeah.
and I might just end up sitting there thinking because I don't outline, so I don't know what I'm doing. But all the rest of the day is, like you said, all the learning how to create little promotional things on Canva and, doing all
Mm.
those other different things. And it's a lot. It's a lot more than I think what people
Yeah.
realize, especially if you're having a book coming out every year. There's a lot attached to all of that. Um,
Mm.
what I was going to ask earlier is you've mentioned you've kind of transitioned a little bit from maybe historical fiction, from your first couple novels to historical fiction. Then now, as you put it, psychological thrillers. Do you feel fairly firmly entrenched in the type you're writing now, or are you like, okay, I'm ready to go on to do something maybe a little different?
Yeah. That's such an interesting question because I think I certainly feel I've never been able to be strategic as a writer. When I say that, I wrote 3 early works, which were about sort of young women, roughly the same age as myself, then 2 historical books, and now I've written 5 psychological thrillers, it makes it sound planned,
Mhm.
as though I did those early books and then I did some historical books and then I hit my stride and did thrillers and then I became bestseller. But in actual fact, it was never that strategic and it was never that organized.
Right.
Um, I have only ever been able to write what I feel passionate about at any given time. And when I wrote my 6th novel, Whatever You Love, which was the first of my novels to be called a psychological thriller, I didn't think I was writing a psychological thriller. I just thought I was writing my next book. And
Mhm.
it was about a woman whose child is killed in a hit and run accident and her
Mhm.
revenge against the driver. But as far as I was concerned, it was every bit as much a character study about my 5th novel, which was a historical novel about women in the 19th century. To me, there was no difference between those books. They were character studies of women at a particular point in their lives. But because the contemporary one had a death and police and a theme of revenge in it, then that got picked up as a psychological thriller. So to me, I feel quite strongly that my job as a writer is actually not to worry about how the books will be perceived, because that's my publisher's job.
Mhm.
My job is to write the story that is in my heart to the best of my ability, and then hand over this kind of mass of pages to the publisher and go, here you are, turn it into a book-shaped thing. That's your job. Um,
Right for yourself. Exactly.
yeah, I write whatever I want to write. And, occasionally it's irksome feeling pigeonholed. I think all writers feel that. All
Mhm.
writers think, well, yes, I do that, but I also do that. Writers are fluid, novels are fluid and nuanced and complex. Readers are fluid and nuanced and complex. One minute I'll read something on the Booker Prize short list, the next I'll be reading a crime novel or a memoir. We're all broad in our tastes. But publishers have to market books somehow.
Right.
And I think we just, if you want to be paid for what you do, you have to respect the publisher's skill and allow them to package the book the way they think best, even if it's irksome being packaged, because it's not our job to worry about that. Our job is to write as well as we can.
Right. And I think a lot of writers, maybe not a lot, but I think some writers think like, well, my job is to write the book. And it's not. It's just part of your job, but part of your job is also be a member, a part of this larger team, just as if you were in corporate organization, that you have to learn where everyone's strengths and weaknesses. And so when they come out with a cover, or maybe they change your title and you don't like it, but you realize this is what they do for a living. This is how they spend their
Yeah.
days. Who am I to say that it's not right just because it's not my favorite thing? So I totally agree with that. Um, but Louise, we're gonna wrap up, but before we do, we're gonna do a quick little storytelling. This is the making it
Right.
up portion of the show.
Right. Okay. This sounds quite scary.
It's not so bad. I mean, I have to do it every goddamn time.
Okay.
You only have to do it once.
Right.
And it'll be short. So I've picked 3 books at random from my bookshelf. You're going to
Okay.
choose one of those books. We're going to
Okay.
pick a random page, and I'm going to pick a random sentence. I'm going to read that sentence. And then after I read that sentence, you just give me the next one or two sentences of what you think happens next. I'll do a couple sentences, and after
Okay.
maybe like 2 minutes, we'll call it a day. So, but
Okay.
I have,
Okay.
I have three very disparate books here. I have a National Book Award finalist, Then We Came to the End, I think, which is
Okay.
maybe 20 years old at this point. A thriller, The Night We Burned by S.F. Kosa, and then
Mhm.
Gone with the Wind. So choose one of those three.
Okay, I tell you, I am so not choosing Gone with the Wind, which
Good,
is
thank you.
the only one of those three that I've read. So I'm going to go. Let's go with the thriller. Let's
Okay,
go with
S.F. Kosa's The Night We Burned. So give me a page
yeah,
number between 1 and 350.
216.
Okay, so let me quickly scan it to see if I can find a sentence that looks good. Lots and lots of dialogue. All right, so I'm just gonna. It's a piece of dialogue, and
Hmm.
the character's name is Essie, Essie.
Hmm.
I was on my way to work, but I wanted to see how you were doing. Essie says.
What do you mean? How am I doing? Harpenden replied. Essie said, I just mean, how are you doing? It's not a loaded question. Harpenden said, it's so a loaded question, and you know precisely why.
Essie looked down at her watch, knowing that she was already going to be at least 15 minutes late to work. And she was already badgering herself for stopping at his house to begin with. But she couldn't help notice the half consumed bottle of scotch on the night table behind him as he stood talking to her in a very dirty robe.
She'd always hated that robe. It represented everything about Harpenden that she loathed. She slipped her bag from her shoulder and put it on the coffee table, leaned forward to open it and said, I've just got to check my diary. I know I'm going to be late. Underneath the diary was the knife.
How many times had she thought about this moment? Sometimes even had dreamt about it. And it was never a good kind of fantasy. The real fantasy came when she thought about what it would be like when it was over. But standing here right now with sweat glazing the palms of her hand, she wasn't sure if she could go through with it.
She slipped her fingers around the handle of the knife inside the bag and looked at him. She thought, I'm going to give you one more chance. And then she said again, so Harpenden, how are you doing?
Oh, I think we call it there. That was great. That
Yeah,
was
I think
lovely.
we could make a novel out of that.
Yeah, that was fun, right? And it's funny, it always gets dark very fast. It's never like, oh,
I
I
know.
brought
I
I
bet.
brought you
How many
breakfast.
times have you done this and people come out with knives? I mean, I
Oh,
bet it happens all the time.
I'm just a little shocked there wasn't blood, but there would have been if we had gone one more minute.
I think there would have been. Yeah.
Well, Louise, what a pleasure to talk to you. I know we got a chance to talk a little bit in Iceland, but not enough. And I remember thinking, I'm like, God, I would love to talk to her on the podcast because she seems like a really entertaining person. And you didn't disappoint.
Thank you. Well, here's hoping we meet at another glamorous international festival soon, because let's face it, that is one of the perks of the job, isn't it?
It is one of the perks of the jobs. Thank you for your time, and looking forward to your next book. All right, folks, that's it. That is my conversation with Louise Doughty, and I told you that that little story was good. I agree. I'm glad we didn't go with Gone with the Wind. When I took that book from my bookshelf, I was kind of thinking that that could be trouble. But fortunately, we went with something that we were able to craft a compelling narrative from. If you want to find out more about Louise, and I highly encourage that you do, simply Google her. She's a big deal. But you can also just go to her website at louisedoughty.com. And while you're online, hopping over to my website, carterwilson.com, you can check out my latest book, which is out now, The Father She Went to Find. You can subscribe to my newsletter. You can check my appearances, or head head over to unboundwriter.com if you're interested in learning more about my one-on-one coaching services, my writing retreats, or my online classes. That's it for now. We've wrapped up another episode of Making It Up. Thanks, as always, for watching and or listening. Next week, we'll have a new episode out for you. In the meantime, take care.